Welcome to Independent Thought and Freedom. The role of China in the world economy is viewed largely negatively in the dominant Western press. China is portrayed as the new imperialist power, seeking to put developing countries in a debt trap in order to capture their resources, strategic assets, and locations. The Belt and Road Initiative, which is China's massive international infrastructural initiative, meant to connect the whole world in a single road and maritime route. It comes from long efforts to decolonize the world economic system. In fact, the Belt and Road Initiative, or the New Silk Road, was not developed by China, in fact, but by the American based global movement of the recently deceased Lyndon LaRouche. His recently widowed wife, Helga Zepp LaRouche, has been by his side for more than 40 years in this struggle, being a leader in her own right and a champion of the Belt and Road Initiative in particular. She was largely behind the successful effort to get China to adopt their New Silk Road proposal, and Zepp LaRouche is leading the movement for the United States to get on board, as well as Europe. Success on these fronts is in sight. In fact, in China, Helga Zepp LaRouche is known as the Silk Road Lady. So I am pleased and honored to have Helga Zepp LaRouche as my guest this week on Independent Thought and Freedom to explain the whole process for us. Helga Zepp LaRouche was born on the 25th of August 1948 in Trier. She's a German political activist, widow of the late American political philosopher, activist, and economist Lyndon LaRouche, and founder of the LaRouche movement's Schiller Institute and the German Bürgerrechtsbewegung Solidarität Party, BUSO, the Civil Rights Movement Solidarity. She's run for political office several times in Germany, representing small parties founded by the LaRouche movement, but she's not held elected office. She is the editor of Das Hitlerbuch in 1984, published by the Schiller Institute, which is a collection of historical investigations into the origins of Nazism. Together with her late husband, she has pursued her political activities in many Asian nations, in Europe, Latin America, and practically all the states of the United States. She's met with numerous political leaders, including Indian Prime Minister Indira Gandhi and Mexican President José López Portillo. She has addressed the Russian State Duma and at high-level institutes and think tanks in China. Helga Zepp LaRouche is one of the world's leading authorities on Friedrich Schiller and on Nicholas of Cusa, the man who contributed more than anyone else to the launching of the European Renaissance of the 15th century. Her scientific work extends from the German classical period to the humanist tradition of universal history and Confucianism. I am very honored to have and to welcome to this podcast Helga Zepp LaRouche. Welcome.
Well, hello, how are you?
Thank you. I'm doing well. How are things in Germany?
Oh, I think Germany is right now in a difficult position, as you could see by the meeting Mrs. Merkel attended yesterday together with President Xi and Macron and Juncker in Paris, because the mood of many countries in the European Union is to cooperate with the new Silk Road of China. And the EU is trying very hard, and Mrs. Merkel also, to somehow solve the conflict between, on the one side, seeing the tremendous advantage of all these economic deals, which they naturally want, but on the other side, they're trying to put the brakes on to supposedly curb the Chinese influence. So it's an interesting moment in history in Germany, and as you know, in many other countries, as you know.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, this is, and you're talking about, this moment in history, and you have, played an enormous role in the shaping of the history that we find ourselves in, even though a lot of people may not understand the role that the LaRouche movement and yourself have been playing. And I want to really delve into that in this interview to explain why this is so important, what we're living through, what is happening, what the potentials are. And I mean, you are really a first-hand player in all of this. So why don't we start off by, can you just describe your history in trying to change the political economic system? I think you've been in it since the 70s. And you know, why has this been such a passion for you?
Well, I had the chance as a young journalist to go with a cargo ship in 1971 on a trip which led me to China. And this was in the middle of the Cultural Revolution. So I got, you know, really an impression of the tremendous turmoil which occurred in China in that period. But this trip also took me very briefly to some ports in Africa, in Asia. And I came back from that trip with the absolute conviction that the underdevelopment of the developing countries could not last, that it had to be overcome. So then I decided to study, and in Berlin I met the theories of what became my husband later on, Mr. LaRouche, and he was the only one who had a comprehensive plan to develop Africa, to develop Latin America and Asia, and undo the poverty and underdevelopment which was the result of colonialism, but also IMF conditionalities.
Was his work taught at your university?
No, this was a private course by one of the associates who also was a professor from the United States, who spoke about the economic theory of my husband, or what became my husband later on. And I was absolutely convinced that that was the only reasonable approach to the whole situation. So I joined what became the LaRouche movement.
Right. Yeah, because I mean, I myself at university studied development studies at the University of Toronto, and then in Jamaica at the University of the West Indies, and I've been involved in then my PhD was in the UK. And in all my studies, I never, ever came across the name of Lyndon LaRouche. It was only after my own independent study afterward, and I realized that we always studied the new international economic order, and especially in the Caribbean, where when the countries achieved independence after the 1960s, the whole criticism of the international system in the terms of trade and the Bretton Woods agreements and the IMF and World Bank. So we knew about the new international economic order, but we had no idea that the role that Lyndon LaRouche played in that. Could you elaborate on that for us?
Well, it is because his world outlook completely contradicted, obviously, the powers to be. I mean, why would it be that the developing countries have been in this condition in the first place? Why did the West not put in infrastructure? I mean, the West could have done what China is now doing around the world with the Belt and Road Initiative. And there's a big, the West is now very upset, and they say China is taking over the world.
In a sense, the Marshall Plan was that for Europe after World War II, wasn't it? And the World Bank was supposed to be a Marshall Plan for the whole world. But
no, I'm sorry, but there's a big difference between the Marshall Plan and the New Silk Road, because the Marshall Plan had a military connotation. In the post-war period, there was first the Morgenthau Plan, which was the idea to turn Germany into an agricultural country. And then when the Cold War started, one decided, okay, let's build up Germany as a bulwark against the Soviet Union.
Right.
Now, this is very different, even if there are similarities in the economic miracle which was caused. But the Belt and Road Initiative has absolutely no such military connotation. And I think that, I think the key question for people to judge this is, what China is now offering to the developing countries in Africa, Latin America, Asia, and even Europe is, what should have naturally happened since a long time. Mm-hmm. And the West did not deliberately develop these continents. And, my husband from the very beginning said that the absolute first condition is to overcome the relics of colonialism and, make a huge science and technology transfer and, start with infrastructure. So we started, with a comprehensive infrastructure program for the entire African continent. As you mentioned in your introduction, we worked with Lopez Portillo on a plan which was called at the time Operation Juarez, which was, in the tradition of the collaboration between Mexico and the United States during the period of Juarez. The idea to integrate the entire Latin American continent through infrastructure as the precondition for industrial development.
Right. Okay. I'd like to expand on this a bit, because you see, a lot of people, when they're looking at the Belt and Road Initiative in China, they're seeing this as a move towards Chinese global hegemony, and they see it as part of geopolitics and so forth. But what I want you to help us elaborate is how this is connected directly to the fight for the new international order from the 70s. And in fact, it comes out of your proposals for the Eurasian landbridge. You presented something in 2001 at the Russian State Duma. But if we go back to the 70s, the initial proposal, as I understand it, was that an infrastructural development bank, I believe it was called, an IDB, was proposed in 1975 as a way for a new Bretton Woods that would, I suppose, replace the World Bank and the IMF. Is that correct? Is that where the genesis you'd see?
Yes, this was proposed by my husband in 1975. It was the idea that since the IMF and the World Bank did not provide the credit for such a large-scale infrastructure and development projects, to create, as you say, an international development bank, which was supposed to generate credit. At that time, we thought about $400 billion per year to finance such infrastructure projects. And we organized with that, in the entire non-aligned movement at the time. We talked to all the embassies, we had contacts in all these countries, so that then at the Colombo conference of the non-aligned movement in 1976, they adopted that program. And if you compare the initial text of the IDB with that final resolution, you find that it's almost identical. And
was Indira Gandhi on board at that point?
Yes. As a matter of fact, the reaction to that was that the West, first of all, did not at all report this. This was a big scandal. I called up the German press agency DPA and said, when are you bringing this? This is great news. They said, oh, this is not newsworthy. We will not report that. I said, what? 3/4 of the human race just decided to have a just new world economic order, and you find this not newsworthy? So they didn't report a single word. And what happened instead is that you had a tremendous counter pressure coming from, the Anglo-Americans or British and so forth. And they destabilized Mrs. Gandhi at the time, Mrs. Bandaranaike from Sri Lanka. Yeah. Bhutto was actually, eventually killed as a result of this. So the whole non-aligned movement basically was not able to carry out this proposal.
Okay, let me just try to put it in context too, because when I was studying this in university, when I was a student, and I'm talking in the 80s, when we were studying the new international economic order and the calls for that within the UN system, within the Bretton Woods financial arrangement, a lot of the complaints of the third world grouping, the non-aligned movement and so forth, was that the World Bank was always to be headed by an American, the IMF was always to be headed by a European, and that they weren't sensitive to the needs of the developing countries, and that there was a move ever since then to change the governance structure of the, like, so the shareholdings, the vote structure, who was ahead, because that would change the whole development policy. How did the LaRouche proposals differ from that? Because it seems more radical than simply changing the governance structure of the existing institutions.
Well, the main idea was to create a credit system. Credit is not the same thing like monetary debt. If you give credit in the direction of future production, let it be infrastructure as the precondition for industry or agriculture, or industrial parks or research and development, investment in basic science education. These are all credits which will lead to an increase of the productivity of the labor force.
Could you explain a little more how credit is different than a loan or aid, for example?
Well, if you give, for example, a state credit, you finance the future production, and it is provable in history that the tax revenue later on of that credit will always be bigger than the original credit, because you're creating wealth, you're creating productive capacity, you're creating factories, you're creating agriculture, you increase the productivity of the labor force. So, it pays for itself. I mean, that is the beauty of the human power, of the power of human labor, that it is productive and you create something more than all the elements which go into the initial production. You create added value, and therefore these credits generate wealth, but they are not causing debt. I think there is a big misunderstanding that, the debt trap, which, if you look at the debt trap, it was the World Bank which caused the debt trap. They would give credits for, let's say, a sausage factory somewhere, and they demanded that this be paid back long before the cattle herd even existed to make the sausage out of. So
right.
That is why a lot of developing countries indeed accumulated this debt. I mean, we looked at the time of Lopez Portillo, Latin America had together $200 billion debt. In the meantime, they have paid, I think, $1.5 trillion, and they still have more debt. So this we call it always bankers' arithmetic, because if you just accumulate this debt and you have to pay it back without creating wealth and production, then it's a debt trap.
So the credit would only be paid back when the enterprise was up and running. Is that the difference?
Well, yeah. I mean, you would give in the kind of proposal which originated with Mr. LaRouche, the idea was to give long-term, low-interest credit. And you would create an international system where you would balance, for example, you have small countries which have no raw materials, you have big countries which have lots of raw materials and few people, then you have large countries who have lots of people and few raw materials. So different conditions, and you have to create a credit system that you balance all of these differences to allow for a harmonious long-term development of all of these countries. So you need like clearing houses who balance these things over 20, 30, even 50 years. And you would not demand the payback of such a credit before the productive capacity has been created, which it was intended for. So it's a completely different system. For example, infrastructure should never be looked at just from the standpoint of profit.
Right.
It's a completely crazy idea to privatize infrastructure and have toll booths, trying to get profit that way, because infrastructure is the absolute precondition for any industrial development. So therefore, it belongs to the kinds of tasks which should be taken over by the state. And, private entrepreneur has basically no interest to invest in infrastructure for that reason.
That's right.
But as the history of Germany, of Russia, of the United States demonstrate, without infrastructure, there is no development.
Right, because this is very important, because this wasn't just an idea that Lyndon LaRouche made up. This comes from the way America developed, which was totally different from the colonial system. The whole colonial system is based on international trade. It's based on the ports. It's based on, like, if you look at the way Africa is developed, it's just cities on the rivers. It's not in the interior. If you look at the way South America is, and that's the way colonial America was. But it was the Hamiltonian vision to develop the entire continent. And it was this system of credit that was important, and then later on adopted by Germany and Japan. And am I correct in this understanding?
Yes, absolutely. Alexander Hamilton created what was later called the American system of economy. And the German economist Friedrich List, who was the founder of the German Customs Union, and he spent some years in the United States, he made the very clear difference between the American system of economy and the British system. The British system is a system of free trade where the profit comes from buying cheap and selling expensive. And the force or the country which controls the trade makes the big profit.
Right.
As compared
It's arbitrage, it's finance capital, it's not production based.
Yes.
Right.
And the American system and the system of Friedrich List and Henry C. Carey on the other side says the only source of wealth is the increase of the creativity of the labor force. So therefore, a good state will do everything possible, to make sure that the education is on the highest possible level, and that, basically the population living standard, healthcare, all of these factors go into a productive labor force. So it's a completely different system. And my husband went back to this tradition, which started with Leibniz, Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, and his notion of physical economy. Also the Colbertists, mercantilists in France. And then, as I said, Hamilton, List, Carey, and he just added the full depths of modern science to the system. And this system is really what China is doing. They may not call it that way, but I think that the Chinese system of economy is much more close to the American system of Alexander Hamilton than most people would suspect.
Now, a lot of people, when they're critical about the Chinese system, talking about debt traps and so forth, the Chinese loan arrangements and stuff are not quite the credit systems that you're describing, are they? They're still loans, and I suppose that's why people are talking. They keep pointing to Sri Lanka and Zaire as examples. How do you interpret that?
Well, I think that the African leaders who participated in the FOCAC conference in Beijing, this was the big China-Africa summit where 50 heads of state participated and tremendous deals were concluded. Many of them, I would say dozens of them, gave interviews and said the whole idea of a debt trap in Africa is completely ridiculous because, with Chinese help, they have built this railway from Djibouti to Addis Abeba. They are building all kinds of rail lines to Cameroon, to Tanzania, to various countries now, even in West Africa, they are moving to build such railways. And for example, President Buhari of Nigeria said, they are creating real wealth in our country, and therefore it's not a debt trap. If you create physical assets, industrial capacities, if you create millions and millions of jobs for Africans, which is what is happening, then it's not a debt trap, but it is uncorking the development potential which Africa has. And I find it very, very good that President Xi Jinping at the BRICS conference in Johannesburg, also last September, said Africa has the largest development potential of all the continents, because they will have, in 2050, they will have 2.5 billion people. Most of them will be young. And if you provide them now with education and jobs and so forth, then obviously Africa will be the new China with African characteristics. So,
and in fact, this is an important thing I want to raise. It's a perspective that you take for granted because of where you're coming from, but other people might not, which is that you see, and China is seeing, human beings as an asset, not as a liability. This whole green movement, this whole this whole paradigm, this Malthusian thing, sees human beings as a liability and not an asset. You want to expand on that a bit?
Yes, that's actually the oligarchical view of man, where you have a privileged elite and they make sure that they have all the privileges, and they want to keep the population reduced and ignorant, because that makes it easier for them to run their affairs.
Yeah, because people say the world is overcrowded. What's your response to that?
Oh, I think every human being born, if you give it him or her the potential to develop all of their qualities which are innate in them, it's every human being can be an Einstein or Beethoven. Naturally, there will be never a second Beethoven, but the degrees of creativity, that everybody can become a genius. And I think that it is the character of the human species that we are creative, and that in the future the human relation will completely change, because we will relate to each other's creativity and treat each other like human beings. I'm actually very optimistic that we are presently at a conjuncture where the whole era of colonialism and imperialism and backwardness can be overcome, and that we enter a new era of civilization, which, I always say, it will be as different as in Europe, the Middle Ages from the modern times.
Yeah.
In the Middle Ages, people believed in scholasticism and, witchcraft and all of these things. And then came the Italian Renaissance and such thinkers as Nicolaus of Cusa, and a completely different image of man occurred, that each individual is limitless perfectible, that with the help of science and technology, you can further the common good, so that, a middle class can develop, that you have, more and more people participating in creative life. So that was the difference between the Middle Ages and the modern times. And I think...
Yeah, because one thing that has really attracted me about your movement over the years, the LaRouche movement, is the emphasis on the mind and creativity, and the way that, Malthus has always been proven wrong because of human creativity and ingenuity. That whatever we conceive of as resources, it's just limited by our minds and our ability, our scientific development. And so the Renaissance that you're talking about in Europe in the 16th century and so forth was something that unlocked the potential of the earth, and that continuing education, whether it be moral, spiritual, scientific, and all these types of blossoming of the human spirit, will unlock the limitless resources that we do have on the earth, and that the mentality of scarcity, which is part of this oligarchical view, is really what we have to fight against too. It's so much of almost a mental battle as well. Would you agree that that's a correct interpretation?
Yes, absolutely. Because you see, the green movement, they are based on a completely wrong idea of the universe. And actually, this whole ecological doctrine, which is really a form of religion, they're now very openly, when they talk about the new Green Deal, this Octavio Cortez, congresswoman from New York, she says people shouldn't have children anymore. There's a new book out in Germany of an author who says that women should be paid 50,000 euro when they are 50 and had no children, because every child is causing pollution, and it's better to have no children. I mean, this is just, coming out now openly what we always said, that
Yes.
the green thing is really about depopulation, and it's an oligarchical view. Such people like Schellenhuber, who is the commander of the British Empire, who is the advisor of Merkel on energy policy, he said, he wants to have the decarbonization of the world economy, and the planet has only room for 1 billion people. So, we have now a polemic, and we make book tables, info tables, where one table says we need more people, and the other one says we need less people, to engage people in a debate. And then when people say, yeah, we need less people, we say, oh yeah, who in your family you think is the least worthy to live, and who should die first? And then they start to smile and say they get the point, that this is actually a genocidal policy.
Yeah.
But I think green ideology has become so pervasive that we really need to be very polemical against it, because I think this new Green Deal is the last effort of this oligarchy at a point where their financial system is about to blow up, and they're trying to divert a lot of investment in so-called sustainable technologies and green technologies. But I think it's a losing paradigm. I'm very optimistic that the Chinese model, which offers real development, is so much more attractive, because people can see that it gives the human being tremendous chances. So I'm optimistic about it.
I think there's just so much prejudice built up against the Chinese, so much negative sort of propaganda, that as soon as they hear the Chinese, they're thinking Tiananmen Square, human rights violations, what they're doing to the Uyghurs, authoritarian, the social, what is it? They have this social ranking system, and that China just wants to control the world, and so people have this this sort of automatic knee-jerk reaction that China is some evil empire in the waiting, and I think that prevents people from sitting back and looking at things as they are. They just have all these filters in front of them. What's your comment on that?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, I was in China in '71, and I saw how people were really unhappy then because of the Cultural Revolution. And then I went back with this conception of a Eurasian land bridge already in '96, and I participated in a big conference in Beijing. And already then, it was like a different country. It was blooming, it was marching forward, people were optimistic. And then I returned many times, in the '90s, in the 2000s, and then in the recent years. And now, people have no idea. I can only say, if you have any chance, go to China, talk to the people. They have the most modern transport system. They have fast trains, which are unmatched by anything in the West, Europe, or in the United States. They have lifted 800 million people out of poverty. They have created a large, growing middle class, and they have the plan to alleviate poverty until 2020. That's in 1 year from now. And Xi Jinping has taken a hands-on approach. He goes to the villages, he talks to people, says, find out what is the cause of your poverty, how can we integrate the farmers into e-commerce, that they can sell their product via the internet, or how do we get infrastructure here. So it is really a system focused on the common good of the people, and it's all based on the Confucian tradition. That's what people don't understand. Maybe there is communism in China, but I have always made the point that it is Chinese socialism with Chinese characteristics. Yeah. And these Chinese characteristics are 2,500 years of more or less unbroken tradition, with the exception of the 10 years of the Cultural Revolution, of Confucian teaching. And what is the essence of Confucian teaching? It is the idea that you need the aesthetical education and moral improvement of the population. And that is sort of in the genes of the Chinese. And Xi Jinping wrote a letter to 8 professors from the Academy of the Fine Arts, who asked him, how important do you see aesthetical education? And he said, I put the highest importance on it, because the aim of aesthetical education is the beauty of the mind and the beauty of the soul.
Absolutely. I mean, I have to endorse that. I mean, when you go to China and Asia in general, but and China, I mean, the sense of optimism, of the future, of beauty, and these things are there in such, you know, it is so palpable. You feel it, you see it in a way that it's almost completely opposite of the West, where there's a feeling of decline and decay and confusion and lack of direction. I certainly agree with that. I want to outline a little bit about this, because I want to really make my listeners have the understanding that this is a global project and not just a Chinese hegemonic project that it's being framed as. And your role in that, because you mentioned the IDB and then how it was endorsed by the non-aligned movement, India and the Asian, African, Caribbean, Latin American countries, and how there was a political undermining of that in the late 70s and 80s, and economic undermining. But then it sort of transformed into this Eurasian land bridge. Could you elaborate on that process, and then also how it ended up that Xi Jinping accepted it? I think that's an interesting story.
Well, my husband made a prognosis in 1984 that if the Soviet Union would not adopt his proposal for what later became, or what had become, the SDI, which is a subject for a whole other program because it's much different than what people think. In any case, he predicted that the Soviet Union would collapse if they would not change their economic policy. And he was probably the only one who said it with that clarity. So in 1988, we had a press conference in Berlin in the Kempinski Hotel, where he predicted that Germany would soon unify. This was 1 year before it happened, that Berlin would become the capital. And then out of that grew a proposal to integrate East and Western Europe through what we called the productive triangle at the time, which was the idea to take the economic region of Paris, Berlin, Vienna, which is very productive, beef it up through modern technology, maglev trains and similar things, and then develop corridors into the Comecon. Now that proposal would have saved the Comecon and the Soviet Union. And when the wall came down, we were literally the only force who had a conception what to do, how to transform the economies of the Warsaw Pact and the Comecon, which were valuable, but they were obsolete from the standpoint of the world market, how you could transform them through such infrastructure and injection of modern technology into a viable economy. So this proposal was accepted by many firms, but they said we need the states to implement it because it's so big. But at that time you had geopolitical forces which did not want Germany to prosper, and especially not have a relationship with Russia. Mm-hmm. So it did not function. But when the Soviet Union collapsed in 91, we took that same program and just extended it to all of Eurasia. It was the idea to connect the industrial and population centers of Europe with those of Asia through infrastructure and development corridors, and then take that as the starting point to develop all the regions and countries in between.
Did you explicitly link it to the ancient Silk Road at that point, or was that a later?
No, we already called it the New Silk Road at that time.
Right.
It was basically the same idea like the ancient Silk Road, to connect the cultures and the countries through trade, through culture exchange, and through philosophy. Mm-hmm. So, we proposed this to all the countries around, and the only country which accepted this idea and actually made this big conference in 96 was China.
Right. So and I just want to emphasize to the readers just about the importance of the Silk Road, because before European imperialism, the Silk Road was the sort of main economic corridor where world trade and commerce took place for thousands of years without imperialism. And then when the whole sort of Columbus enterprise and Da Gama, the maritime route sort of undermined the Silk Road, and it fell, but it didn't completely die. And now this sort of Silk Road, as I understand it, and you can tell me what you think of it, is that reviving that old trade route is part of it. Is also the doing away of the imperial model of economy, of global economy. Would you agree?
Yes. Let me just take it back for 1 second to this 96 conference, because at that point the Chinese science minister already said the development of the Eurasian land bridge is the strategic long-term perspective of China until 2010. Then came the Asia crisis in 97, the Russian state bankruptcy in 98, so it got all interrupted. And we kept just organizing continuously conferences in 5 continents. You know, I think if you count all of them, we probably did hundreds of conferences and seminars, you know, in really hundreds of cities around the world. And, you know, we just kept going because, you know, we thought that that is the right way, even if it's politically not realizable in the moment. And naturally, when President Xi Jinping announced the new Silk Road in September 2013 in Kazakhstan, we were absolutely happy because, you know, this is what essentially we had been fighting for decades.
And I'd really like to stop here to ask you to expand a bit. I am so amazed and impressed at your ability to do this, because I mean, in the United States, the movement is very vilified. You were persecuted by Robert Mueller himself, you know, in the 1980s, and you know, it's suppressed. Hardly anybody knows about it. The people that do know about it, they have such a negative view in so many ways, particularly in the mainstream media, and yet you're able to mobilize with governments and around the world, whether it be Latin America, the Caribbean, Asia, Africa, and you convince the largest economy in the world to on the rightness of your proposals. How does your organization do this? Could you give us some insight?
Well, I think my husband has created a movement, a philosophical association, which attracts people who are not attracted by the lust for money or the profit or career in some. Most people who pursue careers do that at the price of participating in evil.
Mm-hmm.
If you are a doctor, you participate in triage of the health system. If you are, anyway, I mean, I'm not saying everybody who does these professions are bad, but you're participating in a system which is profoundly unjust.
Yeah.
So, while our way for sure was more difficult, and, not everybody stayed with the movement because, when you meet such a lot of real enemies, coming from the depths of the oligarchical system, it's very difficult. But I think Mr. LaRouche has really created a renaissance movement of people who believe that it is better that you do with your life whatever you can to improve the cause of humanity, that your life is not just between bookends. You are born, you die, and then on your tomb or gravestone it's written you ate so many tons of caviar and you had so many Porsches and that was it. But that you think in terms of what was the greatness of people like Plato, Confucius, Leibniz, Schiller, and you take the best of all of these great minds of universal history and you say, how can we make sure that these ideas are being promoted? And if you're lucky, you develop your own little creative edition, so that you're inner directed. You're not depending on if you find approval or if some jerk says I like what you say or not, but that you have a plan how to shape the future of humanity.
And this is part of your sort of Renaissance education, I think. You're trying to spark that inner direction. I really see that as part of your movement, and I admire that. And this is why I want to emphasize this, because you're also working very hard to get the United States on board this. And because of the way the international media has framed the Belt and Road Initiative as a project of Chinese hegemony, and then framing Russia and China as being sort of enemies of freedom and human rights, and it just makes it difficult, if not impossible, for the United States to get involved. But tell me about your efforts, the reason why the United States should get involved, and your efforts, and what do you think the prospects of that are now, of the United States getting involved in the World Landbridge?
Well, if you look at Italy, Italy is just completely on board with the Belt and Road Initiative. Xi Jinping was in Rome, in Palermo, and they signed a memorandum of understanding of full cooperation between the two countries, also in the development of Africa. I think this is very important. Now, more and more European countries are joining the 16+1 Eastern and Central European countries: Greece, Italy, Spain, Portugal, Switzerland, Austria. So the momentum is clearly in the direction of the new paradigm. And the United States obviously is the big question, and people are very concerned. Will the rise of China lead to the Thucydides trap, where the rising power is not being accepted by the dominant power up to that point, and it will lead to war, like it did 12 times in history before? Mm-hmm. Actually, in the time of thermonuclear weapons, this could lead to the destruction and annihilation of the entire human species. So there are some people who know that. And the good thing is that President Trump, has a spontaneous favor for China. He sees it as a great nation. He calls Xi Jinping his good friend all the time. And he's naturally surrounded by a lot of forces who want to prevent that from happening. But these forces just suffered a tremendous setback because the famous Mueller report, Robert Mueller could not prove a single piece of evidence that Trump would have colluded with Russia in the 2016 election. And it could very well be, as Giuliani, his lawyer, Trump's lawyer, just said, that now they will investigate who caused all of this pain of the Russia Gate and the anti-Trump campaign to try to get Trump out of office. So, we have published a lot of reports about that, pointing to the role of the British, actually, the British government, the British Secret Service, mm-hmm. the collusion was of the intelligence heads of the Obama administration with a foreign government, except it was not Russia, it was the British. Now, this could all now be investigated, and therefore these forces could suffer a serious setback. Some of them may even suffer criminal prosecution. And, in any case, the whole situation has been broken. And there are many states, especially in the Midwest, but also in Texas, and, who states who understand that it is in their economic benefit to cooperate with China. So, we are right now launching, or have launched, a big campaign that, the Chinese should help the United States to rebuild their infrastructure. Yeah. I don't think the United States at this point even have the capacity to rebuild their infrastructure, which is absolutely collapsing. If you go from Washington to New York, do not go with a small car because it may vanish in a pothole. Yeah. The subways are collapsing. China has tremendous expertise to build infrastructure. So if the United States would say the Chinese could invest their $1.5 trillion treasury bonds in such infrastructure investment in the United States, and we in turn invite the United States to cooperate in joint ventures in third countries, like the building up of Africa, Latin American investments. You can establish a completely new set of international relationships.
Yeah, that's truly win-win. It's solving the U.S. China debt imbalance by taking the treasury bonds and reinvesting it in the States. It's then helping U.S. industry in investing in the third world, and then it's helping the third world through that infrastructural development. I mean, it's just a total win-win all around. I mean, it sounds like a perfect solution. And you see, I wanted to tie this into the largeness of your vision, which always attracts me to the LaRouche movement, because you also have this thing about the four powers agreement, where you're pushing for India, the United States, China, and Russia to replace the Bretton Woods system. So again, this ties in to the vision from the 70s, and this shows an integrity of the vision and the mission, a persistence. And so can you just explain this four powers agreement and then how the Belt and Road initiative works into that? Because it's really a rebuilding of the whole world economy as I understand it.
Well, originally my husband had proposed the four-power collaboration of the United States, Russia, China, and India, simply to make the point that you need a combination of countries strong enough to be a counterweight to the financial oligarchy, which is sitting headquartered in London and also Wall Street. So, this has historical precedents, the collaboration of Roosevelt with the Soviet Union in the Second World War. Also, that combination of these four countries is pretty much representative also, for the other countries as well. Not to say that they will totally replace them, but, if you take the United States for the West and you take China for Asia and Russia, India, I mean, you have pretty much a good representation of what, would have been the interest of the non-aligned movement. Mm-hmm. So once you get a collaboration, and I think it needs the level of the presidents, because as you can see, Putin and Trump made it very well off in Helsinki. President Modi and Xi Jinping made it very well in Wuhan when they met there. So once you go, and we have right now, I think, the fortune that we have four presidents who are quite extraordinary. I think President Xi is an extraordinary leader. Putin is a brilliant strategist. Trump is amazing. Despite all the slanders against him, he withstood a witch hunt, which is quite unprecedented. Mm-hmm. So I think that, if these four leaders can, in the next period, get together and would adopt, what we have written in our two reports, the new Silk Road becomes the world landbridge, which is the idea that you connect all the continents through infrastructure, bridges, tunnels. You open up the inner lands through infrastructure development. You can transform this planet for all the people to live a decent life. And nobody wants to have more billionaires, because I think they are completely superfluous, because, they have so much money that it becomes ridiculous. But a decent life, a decent education, a humanist aesthetical education for all the children on this planet, if this would happen, I think oligarchism and a lot of evils which go along with it would vanish like children's diseases. Yeah. Certain diseases only children get. And once you are grown up, you don't get them anymore. And I have this vision, that the human race can create a renaissance where people will overcome this problem of colonialism and oligarchism, because the human species is creative. We may not be the only creative species in the universe, but we are the only one we know of so far. So we should really realize that true identity of our species.
Now, I mean, you continue to do so much work, so many conferences you organize, so many books you put out, so many blog posts and videos, podcasts, so all these things. If for listeners that are interested to learn more, because I mean, it's a whole world of information that you have that you keep producing consistently. Where should they look? schillerinstitute.org or LaRouche Pub? What are the websites that someone who's just wants to get into it and find out more? Where should they go?
Well, first of all, we have the schillerinstitute.com.
.com.
New Paradigm, Schiller Institute. This has many languages programs. We have Chinese, Russian, Spanish. So you can go to that website. I'm doing an English webcast every week. So if you want to hear my views every week, you're welcome to listen. Then we have in English also the LaRouche Pack website where if you want to know what's going on in the United States, that's the place to go. Then we have French, Italian, Swedish, Danish. So you're welcome to visit us many times.
Right. Now, in sum, what would you say your main messages that you want to put out to the world? How would you summarize it in a pithy message?
Well, I think we are at a very crucial moment in history where on the one side, there is the danger that things could go really wrong. I mean, the danger of war is not overcome at all. There are many people who think that the situation is actually more dangerous than at the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and that says a lot. On the other side, I think that we are so close to a completely new kind of, world where, poverty can be eradicated in every corner of the world. People can, work together on things like space missions, on the development of thermonuclear fusion as a commercial source of energy, and that way creating energy and raw material security for the entire planet. So, we are at a branching point. And what I would call on all of you is not to just sit by and say, okay, let's see how this turns out and who wins, but become active. You can become a member of the Schiller Institute. You can help us to spread the beautiful vision of these potentialities, because I think optimism is really important. A country which is in pessimism like Germany right now, or much of the United States, it has a terrible effect on what people think. You have in the United States a suicide epidemic, opioid epidemic. In China, for example, people are optimistic. 90% of the people agree with their government. They think that, they have a great future. And I talk to Chinese students many times and they say, oh, I go to Africa, I help to develop this continent. It completely changes the way you think about yourself and your life. So the minimum you can do is help us to spread the knowledge about these potentials, and even better, become active with us.
Excellent. And that's the advice. I was going to ask if you had any advice, and whether you just gave that advice to become active. Yeah. And just finally, as a reflective thing, I mean, you've been in this for so long. You've been working so hard at this, and there's been ups and downs. But it really, I mean, I think it's such a wonderful story, because so much of what you've been advocating, it's on the cusp of being realized. But looking back, if you had to do your 40 years over again, would you change anything in your path?
Not essentially. Maybe here and there I probably would use certain experiences to do things better, but not really. I think that, as you mentioned, my husband just passed a very short period ago. And despite the fact that naturally, it's still extremely painful, but looking back at the life we had together, I think was the richest life you can have. And I had the fortune to be married to the most beautiful human being on the planet. and we did wonderful things together. And I think, I think that's the way to live.
Absolutely. And I want to extend my condolences still. I know it's been a few weeks, but really, he was a really amazing person. I never met him in person, but I've followed him, and I know many of your associates, and I mean, he was just a brilliant man. And people will be revisiting his work for decades to come, if not more, if not longer.
Actually, that would be my advice. Read the books and many writings of my husband, and you will see that this is the most interesting and most wise thing you can find about the future of civilization. So read it.
Yes, absolutely. Well, I want to thank you so much, not only for this interview, but for your work in general, your tireless efforts to bring about a new, just, peaceful, and prosperous order for mankind. I mean, what you do is incredible, and I admire it tremendously. Your bravery and your vision, it's admirable, and it's very, very important. And as I said, what you've been doing is of historic importance, and I feel really fortunate to have interviewed you during this time. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
So that's all for Independent Thought and Freedom this week. Please join us again next week. And in the meanwhile, make sure you subscribe, leave me a rating, like and share this podcast with your friends. Thanks, and bye for now.